One single boom rolled across the fields of Normandy, deep, hollow, like a hammer striking steel. Then silence. Every German soldier in the hedgerows turned toward the sound. They had heard artillery before, thousands of rounds over 7 long weeks. But this was different. This one shell came alone, precise, deliberate, a signal. In the sunken lanes south of Saint-Lô, veteran grenadiers looked at one another with questions in their eyes. At makeshift command posts dug into the reverse slopes, officers lowered their binoculars and waited. Something was coming. They could feel it in their chests, a faint vibration rising through the soles of their boots, growing stronger with each second. The men in those hedgerows still believed they might see another quiet day. They had exactly 60 seconds left to live. This is the story of July 25, 1944. The day 1,000 American guns spoke at once. The day the bocage finally broke, and the day the world learned that courage alone could not stop the machine age of war. The hedgerows of Normandy had become a graveyard of green, those thick walls of earth and tangled roots. Rows 6. Sometimes 8 feet high on either side of every narrow lane, centuries old, grown tight as prison bars. 7 full weeks after the Allies had stormed the beaches at Omaha and Utah, and still the bocage refused to let them pass. A cold mist hung in the air, neither quite rain nor quite fog, just moisture that clung to everything, to wool uniforms, to rifle slings, to the souls of men who had already seen too much. The stalemate had cost both sides dearly. Every field, every lane, every farmhouse became a miniature battlefield. The Allies had expected to be racing across France by now. Instead, they measured progress in yards. The Germans, bleeding and exhausted, held on with the desperate tenacity of men who knew retreat meant the end. But everything was about to change. At a makeshift command post dug into the reverse slope of a low hill, 2 miles south of Saint-Lô, Major General Heinrich von Lang, 45 years old, stood bent over a folding map lit by a single kerosene lantern. The light threw hard shadows across his face. 5 years of war had carved deep lines there. First, the burning sand of the Afrika Korps under Rommel, then the frozen hell of the Eastern Front. He had learned one hard truth that no staff college ever taught. Orders radioed from Berlin almost never matched the dirt under a man's boots. A runner, breathing hard, mud up to his knees, dropped to one knee beside the general. Divin strength, sir. 2,200 combat effectives. 45 armored vehicles still able to move, most of them damaged or low on fuel. Von Lang stared at the numbers until they blurred. Panzerlehr, once the proudest armored division in the German army, had rolled into Normandy with 200 tanks and over 14,000 men. Now it was a shadow, a ghost of what it had been. He rubbed his eyes with the heel of his hand. The stubble on his jaw scraped like sandpaper. "Tell the men to dig deeper," he said, voice low and steady. "No one pulls back. Not 1 yard." The runner hesitated, water dripping from his helmet. "Sir, intelligence says the Americans are massing everything they have right here. They're coming." Von Lang's voice stayed flat, almost tired. "Hitler forbids withdrawal. The Fuhrer still believes the real blow will fall at Calais. We stay." The order pinned them in place like nails driven into a coffin lid. A mile away, in a sunken lane choked with hawthorn and blackthorn, Sergeant Otto Reinhardt, 26, crouched beside a Panzer IV that had lost its left track 2 days earlier. He held a letter he had already read a dozen times, his wife, Anna, and their 2 small boys, back in a little village outside Munich. The paper still carried the faintest smell of home. Wood smoke, fresh bread, the soap she used on the children's clothes. That smell no longer existed in Normandy. Beside him sat Private Franz Keller, 19, face still smooth under the grime of war. The boy had arrived as a replacement only 10 days earlier, straight from a training depot in Germany. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to clean mud from the bolt of his rifle. "Any word from home, Sergeant?" Franz asked, voice barely above a whisper. Otto folded the letter with slow, careful fingers and slipped it back inside his tunic. "They're alive. That's enough these days." He looked at the boy and saw his own younger self staring back, eager, scared, still believing courage could change the world. "Keep your head down today, Franz. This war doesn't care how brave you want to be. It only cares whether you're lucky." They shared a tin cup of cold ersatz, coffee that tasted of burned acorns and regret. Around them, the rest of the platoon. 30 exhausted grenadiers leaned against the earthen bank of the hedgerow, smoking the last of their cigarettes down to the fingernails. No one spoke much. Words felt heavy when death waited just beyond the next field, around the next bend, in the next hour. Then hope arrived on a mud-splattered motorcycle. A staff officer roared up the lane, engine coughing. He killed the bike and swung off, waving a sheaf of fresh radio intercepts. "Good news, boys. Patton's army is still sitting in England. The Yanks are pulling forces north. Deception or not, High Command says they're not ready for a big push here. We might even get a quiet day." The men looked at one another. A few tired smiles broke through the dirt-caked faces. Someone laughed, short and bitter. "Quiet day in Normandy." Those two words sounded like mercy from heaven. Otto glanced sideways at Franz. The boy's shoulders dropped a fraction. For the first time in weeks, something like hope flickered in his young eyes. The kind of hope only 19-year-olds can still carry before the world teaches them better. By 9:30 that morning, the mist had thinned just enough to let pale sunlight touch the tops of the hedgerows. The lanes looked almost peaceful. Birds called from the treetops. A light breeze moved through the wet grass, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke from distant farmhouses and the ever-present odor of damp earth and cordite. Major General von Long stepped outside his command bunker, binoculars hanging from his neck, and stood listening to the unnatural stillness. His adjutant offered him a cigarette. He waved it away. "Too quiet," he muttered, to no one in particular. At exactly 9:38 a.m., it happened. One single boom rolled across the fields from the north, deep, hollow, like a hammer striking steel. Every head in the German lines turned at once. Franz straightened up, eyes wide. "Just one shell?" Otto wiped moisture from his eyes with the back of his hand. "Sounded like a ranging shot. They'll walk the rest in slow. We know the drill by now." A grenadier a few yards away chuckled darkly. "One boom, and they think they can scare Panzerlehr? Amateurs." Von Lang lowered his binoculars. For 3 long seconds, the world held its breath. No whistle of incoming rounds. No rising shriek that gave men time to dive for cover. Just silence, thick, heavy, unnatural. Then the general felt it in his chest first, a faint vibration rising through the soles of his boots, growing stronger with each second. That single boom was not a ranging shot. It was the signal for Operation Cobra, the breakout offensive the Allies had planned for weeks. The Americans had synchronized more than 1,000 guns using a technique the Germans had never faced on this scale. Time on target. Every shell timed by stopwatch and mathematics to arrive together at the same second on the same square yard of French soil. The men in the hedgerows still smiled. They still believed today might be quiet. They had exactly 60 seconds left to live. The mist began to lift. Far to the north, the drone of hundreds of bomber engines filled the sky. The earth was about to erupt. The single boom had barely faded when the sky tore open. It did not come as they expected. No slow building. Shriek of shells arcing high and falling one by one. No time to shout a warning. No chance to dive for cover. At 9:38 a.m. on July 24, 1944, more than 1,000 American guns spoke at once. The earth simply rose up and tried to kill them all. Major General Heinrich von Lang was standing outside his command bunker when the first wave struck. The ground heaved like a living thing beneath his boots. He was thrown 10 feet backward into the mud, his helmet spinning away into the gray air. Dirt and steel fragments rained down in a blinding storm. The dust hung so thick that men could not see 10 yards in any direction. When he pushed himself up, on one elbow, blood already trickling from both ears, the world he had known only seconds earlier had vanished. His command post, a carefully dug hole into the reverse slope of the hill, was now a crater 30 yards across. Maps, radios, field telephones, and 3 of his staff officers lay buried under tons of fresh earth and shattered timber. He could not hear his own voice when he screamed, "This is hell!" The words tore out of him raw and broken, the same words he would repeat in nightmares for the rest of his life. Around him, the bocage had become a landscape of the moon. Ancient hedges lay shredded into matchsticks and smoking fragments. Ancient apple trees lay broken like shattered bones. Where neat green fields had been only, minutes earlier, only overlapping destruction remained, some holes 20 feet deep, already filling with black water and twisted metal. A Panzer IV 30 yards away flipped onto its back, 30 tons of steel overturned. Its turret tore free and cartwheeled through the dust. Inside the hull, the crew never had time to scream. Von Lang staggered toward the wreckage, boots slipping in the churned earth. His lungs burned. Every breath tasted of cordite and chalk. He grabbed a surviving corporal by the collar, the young man's eyes already vacant with shock. "Get me a runner, any runner. Tell every company to hold position." The corporal stared back with empty eyes. Blood leaked slowly from his nose. He nodded once, turned, and ran, straight into a second curtain of steel that tore the air apart and simply erased him from existence. The barrage walked methodically across the entire front of Panzerlehr, overlapping, precise, merciless. 5 miles to the rear, American artillery observers watched through binoculars and nodded with grim satisfaction. But forward, in the sunken lanes and hedgerows, the men of Panzerlehr were learning what industrial war truly meant. Sergeant Otto Reinhardt had been kneeling beside Private Franz Keller when the world exploded. 1 second they were sharing the last of a cigarette, the paper warm between their fingers. The next, the hedgerow to their left simply ceased to exist. The blast wave slammed both men against the opposite earthen bank with the force of a freight train. Franz's rifle flew from his hands and disappeared into the chaos. Otto tasted blood and dirt in his mouth. He grabbed the boy by the webbing of his harness and dragged him into a shallow shell, scraped no deeper than a grave. "Stay down," Otto shouted. His own voice sounded miles away, muffled by the ringing in his ears. Franz's face was white with shock. 19 years old, and already learning the hardest lesson of all, that courage was mostly about not running when your legs demanded it. He clutched Otto's sleeve like a frightened child clutching his father. Another salvo landed 50 yards away. The pressure wave punched the air from their lungs. A grenadier 10 feet to their right simply disappeared in the blast. His helmet rolled past Otto's boots. Still warm to the touch, they crawled forward on elbows and knees, past fallen soldiers beyond recognition. The mud sucked at their boots and knees with wet, greedy sounds. Dust burned their eyes. Every few seconds, the ground jumped again, throwing them flat against the earth, as if some giant hand had slapped them down. The smell of burned powder and torn flesh filled the air so thick they could taste it. Communications were gone. No radio, no telephone wire. No runner could live longer than 30 seconds in the open. The entire division, 2,200 men, only hours earlier, had been cut into isolated, bleeding pockets. 3 battalion headquarters simply no longer existed. 70% of Panzerlehr's fighting strength was gone in the first 15 minutes. Tanks that had survived the deserts of Africa and the frozen steppes of Russia now lay on their sides like dead whales, tracks spinning uselessly in the air. Otto and Franz reached a small group of survivors huddled in what had once been a sunken road. 8 men, 1 machine gun with a bent barrel. A single Panzer V with its engine still coughing and sputtering, its commander dead in the open turret. Otto looked at their faces, young, old, terrified, numb, and felt something tighten hard in his chest. "We are all that is left here," he said quietly, voice steady despite the blood on his lips. "We hold this lane for Germany, for the men who cannot hold any more." Franz nodded. His hands no longer shook. War had aged him 10 years and 10 minutes. Farther north the sky changed again. The low drone Otto had half-heard earlier now filled the heavens like the approach of judgment. Wave after wave of American heavy bombers, more than 1,500 of them, came in, low and steady, flying straight and unafraid. They dropped their loads in long, deliberate carpets. 4,000 tons of high explosive fell in the space of a single hour. The sound was beyond description, a continuous, rolling thunder that pressed against the skull until men wept without knowing why. Trees exploded. The ground itself seemed to scream. Von Lang had dragged himself to higher ground, behind the lines, half deaf, bleeding from a scalp wound. How watched the bombers pass overhead like dark crosses against the gray sky. His adjutant, bleeding from his own wounds, crawled up beside him. "Sir, our forward positions, they are gone." Von Lang said nothing. He simply stared. The general, who had led men through Rommel's greatest victories, now watched his elite division disappear beneath a rain of American steel. Then came the terrible irony of industrial war. Some of the bombers, either misdirected by the thick clouds of dust and debris or flying just a fraction too far south, released their loads directly onto the American lines. Friendly fire, the same rain of steel that was destroying Panzerlehr now, fell among the very men who had called it down. Von Lang saw the flashes through the haze. American troops caught in their own storm. Later he would learn the full details. 111 American dead, nearly 500 wounded. Among them was Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, 61 years old, the highest-ranking American officer, killed in action during the entire war in Europe. A single 500-pound bomb landed 30 yards from his forward observation post. The blast hurled his body 80 feet through the air. He was found still clutching his binoculars, uniform shredded, killed instantly. McNair had insisted on observing the attack from the front lines, despite warnings, believing that leaders should see combat with their own eyes. Von Lang lowered his head for a long moment. Even in the middle of destruction, war took its own. He felt no triumph in the sight, only the cold knowledge that the machine on the other side was now eating its own children, as well as his here. The bombing finally eased toward noon. The dust hung so thick that men could not see 10 yards in any direction. What had been a proud division was now scattered bands of walking wounded and stunned survivors, but not every man had broken. A handful of stubborn ghosts refused to die. Otto Reinhardt, Franz Keller, and 11 other grenadiers had found the surviving Panzer IV. Its engine still coughed and sputtered. They climbed aboard, loaded the last belts of ammunition, and rolled the tank forward through the destruction until it commanded the narrow lane leading north. American infantry from the 1st Army, the 5th Corps, began to advance behind the barrage. They expected nothing. They had been told the German line was obliterated. They were wrong. Otto's small group opened fire. The machine gun chattered in short, angry bursts. The Panzer's 75mm gun barked twice, knocking out the lead American Sherman before its crew could react. Grenades sailed through the haze. Men shouted in English and German across the narrow lane. For 2 long, brutal hours, that little knot of survivors held the lane. They bought time with their lives, time for the few remaining German units farther back to pull together what scraps they could. American progress that first day measured barely 2,000 meters, not the sweeping breakout Eisenhower had hoped for. Not yet. Otto fired the machine gun until the barrel glowed red. Franz handed him fresh belts, his young face streaked with tears and powder burns. Neither spoke. Words were unnecessary. They were alive, and in that moment there was victory enough. By late afternoon, the firing slackened. The Americans paused, regrouped, and tried to understand why a division they had just erased from the map was still biting back like a wounded animal. Von Lang, somewhere in the rear, received the first fragmented reports by motorcycle courier. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of a man who had just watched his elite formations die in a single morning. "Tell them to keep fighting," he said, "even if it is only with rifles and prayers." The sun hung low and heavy over the shattered bocage as evening settled across the fields of Normandy. On July 25, 1944, columns of gray-black residue still rose in slow, lazy spirals from destruction, the size of small ponds. The air smelled of wet earth, burned powder, and something far worse. Major General Heinrich von Lang stood on a low ridge that had once been a solid hedgerow, his uniform torn at the shoulder, his face streaked with dirt and dried blood. At 45 years old, he had seen the deserts of North Africa and the frozen killing fields of Russia, but he had never seen anything like this. What remained of Panzer Lehr lay scattered across the moonscape before him. Tanks rested on their backs like dead turtles, tracks spinning slowly in the evening breeze. Rifles poked up from the churned soil like broken crosses, marking graves that would never be dug. The division had arrived in Normandy with pride and 200 tanks. Now fewer than 700 men could still lift a weapon. Von Lang's adjutant, limping badly, handed him a crumpled report written in pencil on the back of a ration tin. The general read it once, folded it away without a word, and stared out across the devastation. 70% gone, he said quietly, almost to himself. In one morning, the end came not with another explosion, but with silence. American scouts from 7th Corps moved forward cautiously as twilight deepened. They expected the same fierce resistance they had fought all day. Machine guns, 88s, determined grenadiers. Instead, they found gaps. The German line, once a solid wall of foxholes and interlocking fire, had become nothing but isolated pockets of exhausted men, holding patches of ground that no longer mattered. No continuous front, no depth, just small bands of survivors, too stunned to run and too stubborn to surrender. By the next morning, July 26, the truth hit the American commanders like clear daylight after a long storm. The bombing had not failed. It had succeeded beyond their wildest hopes. The defensive crust of the German position was broken. Orders went out fast and sharp. Bypass the strong points. Push south. Push hard. Do not stop. Within hours the flood began. Shermans rolled through the devastation infantry, riding on the decks. Engineers clearing paths with bulldozers and bare hands. What had been a bloody stalemate for 7 long weeks turned into a torrent. By July 28, the German defenses across the entire American sector had collapsed. Coutances fell. Avranches opened like a great iron gate. Patton's Third Army was activated on August 1 and roared into the breach with everything it had. The breakout from Normandy, the moment the Allies had waited for since D-Day, had finally begun. Back in the ruins of that narrow lane, Sergeant Otto Reinhardt and Private Franz Keller still held their position with 9 other survivors. The Panzer IV they had nursed through the long afternoon now sat silent, out of fuel, its gun barrel warped from heat. Otto, 26, leaned against the wrecked track, cleaning his rifle with slow, deliberate strokes. The motion was almost meditative. Franz, 19, sat beside him on an empty ammunition box, staring at nothing in particular. His young face looked 10 years older than it had at dawn. "We held," Franz said, voice hoarse from shouting and breathing cordite. Otto nodded once. For today, he looked at the boy and felt the weight of every promise he had made to Anna back home. "But the Americans are already flowing around us. Radio silence is total. No more orders are coming. They had no illusions left." The enemy was bypassing them, moving south in long columns of steel and dust. Yet they stayed until full darkness covered the field, firing the last belts of ammunition at its shadows that never quite came. When the night finally grew deep enough to hide them, Otto stood up slowly, knees cracking. "Time to move, son. We've done what we could. More than most." They slipped south through the devastation, 2 ghosts among thousands of other ghosts. Franz looked back once as the lane they had defended with their lives. Then he followed Otto into the darkness without another word. In the quiet hours before midnight, Major General von Lang sat alone in a ruined stone farmhouse 3 miles to the rear, a single lantern burned on an ammunition crate. He stared at a map he no longer needed. The American advance was already marked in pencil, arrows sweeping south like a tide that could not be turned. He understood now, with a clarity that cut deeper than any wound, exactly what had happened here on this ordinary July morning. This was not war as he had known it, tanks against tanks, man against man, individual valor measured in yards of ground gained. This was industry against flesh. Factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh and Chicago had spoken louder than any general on the Eastern Front. One morning of coordinated fire and steel had done what months of brilliant maneuver could never achieve. The age of the individual soldier, of the brilliant commander leading from the front, was ending. The machine had taken its place. Von Lang rubbed his eyes with dirty fingers. He thought of the young faces he would never see again. He thought of Sergeant Reinhardt and boys like Franz Keller, still out there, somewhere in the darkness, still trying to do the impossible. He thought of Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, the American, whose body had been hurled 80 feet by his own bombs, and felt a strange, bitter kinship. Both of them had believed in leading from the front, in seeing the battlefield with their own eyes. Only one had paid the final price for that belief. "This changes everything," he whispered to the empty room. "The old rules are gone." The weeks that followed proved him right in the hardest possible way. The remnants of Panzer Lehr fought on through the chaos of the Falaise Pocket in August. Von Lang led what was left, fewer than 200 men, until the trap closed around them. He escaped on foot, one of the lucky ones, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and the memory of that single boom that had changed everything. Otto Reinhardt and Franz Keller made it out too. They fell back with other scattered groups, moving by night, living on what they could scavenge, until they reached the German lines near the Seine. Otto would later write a short letter to his wife from a field hospital. "I am alive. The boy is alive." The war goes on, but something broke that day in Normandy that will never mend. Franz, hardened far beyond his 19 years, would carry the weight of that morning for the rest of his life, though he rarely spoke of it. The strategic impact was immediate and devastating. Operation Cobra, despite the tragic friendly fire casualties, had achieved exactly what it was designed to do. The German defensive line in Normandy, which had held the Allies to a crawl for nearly 2 months, simply ceased to exist as a coherent force. Within a week, American armor was racing across France faster than even the most optimistic planners had imagined. Paris would be liberated by August 25. The German army in France was in full retreat, never to recover the initiative in the West. Years after the guns finally fell silent, old soldiers on both sides would sit on quiet porches in America and in Germany. They would share stories over coffee or whiskey, speaking of Saint-Lô, not with hatred, but with the quiet respect of men who had looked into the same furnace and walked away changed. They understood something the history books often forget. Individual bravery still mattered on that terrible morning. The stubborn defense of isolated German positions, like Otto's lanes, though ultimately futile, had slowed the American advance just enough to prevent a complete collapse on the first day. Those few hours bought time for thousands of German soldiers to escape encirclement. But they also understood the larger truth. In the summer of 1944, outside Saint-Lô, the world learned that factories and bombers and the cold mathematics of time-on-target artillery could end a stalemate faster than any amount of courage or tactical brilliance. The Battle of Saint-Lô was not just a turning point in the campaign for France. It was a preview of warfare's future, where industrial capacity and technological coordination would matter more than individual heroism. One boom, 1,000 shells arriving at once, and the road to Paris lay open at last. The bocage had finally broken. And with it went the belief that individual courage alone could change modern war's outcome. The machine age had arrived on the battlefield. Its lesson would echo through every conflict to come.